Joining me on this panel are Scott Amyx, Managing Partner of Astor Perkins, Nick Engelfried, activist and author, and Ilana Cohen, youth climate activist and freelance climate journalist.
Tell us about your involvement with climate activism.
My name's Ilana. I'm mostly a divestment activist. So I became involved in sort of activism for climate justice growing up in New York City and really seeing the effects of Hurricane Sandy from when I was 12. And eventually when I got to college, became very engaged in divestment activism because divestment seemed like this really powerful way of getting big institutions like my university, Harvard, to stand on the right side of history and against fossil fuel industry malfeasance, blocking a just energy transition. So over the last few years, I've sort of helped grow the divestment movement. We actually won our campaign for divestment at Harvard and then evolved that kind of campus-based organizing to a new level with the organization I now co-founded and help run, which is called Fossil Free Research, and is focused on dismantling research partnerships between academic institutions and the oil industry, and more broadly, getting academic institutions to cut ties to oil and gas majors.
Great.
And I've been involved in climate activism for quite a while, for about since the early 2000s. I was back when I was a college student, I was kind of part of the generation of youth climate activists before Ilana. And since then, I have stepped back from that role a bit. I'm more of someone who writes about what others are doing now. As an author and journalist, I wrote this book, Movement Makers, How Young Activists Upended the Politics of Climate Change, that came out last year. And it was actually through that project that I ended up speaking with over 100 youth climate activists, folks like Ilana. That's how we first connected, I think. And have been, I see now my role as sort of just documenting how youth climate activism and climate activism in general is mobilizing people, mobilizing resources in support of a transition to clean energy.
Great. Thank you both for your introduction. And Ilana, I think I recently saw that you were recognized for your undergrad thesis that you wrote? So
I finished it. I don't know if I haven't received any recognitions as of now. Maybe in the future, I hope.
All right. Okay.
I did just finish my thesis. It's on the ethics of climate refugeehood.
Fair enough. Well, I know that most of you probably have seen at least a summary of the most recent IPCC report that came out last month, I believe. The researchers gave their most urgent warning, indicating that we're just not making progress fast enough. How do you respond to that?
So I think that the report is pretty sobering, honestly, because we're at this moment in time when, on the one hand, there's really exciting things going on. Like, we're in the US and many other countries, we're mobilizing resources for the clean energy transition on a scale that has never happened before. But this report from the IPCC is kind of a reminder that, like, we still have a lot of, it's going to take a lot to keep us within the bounds of what scientists say are anything like safe levels of climate change in order to keep warming with under 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have to reduce global carbon emissions 43% by 2030. That's from the report. And that is a huge reduction in a relatively pretty short amount of time. So it's a reminder that while there are a lot of positive developments, we can't be complacent about this. We've really got to keep pushing the envelope if we're going to stay within the bounds of safety.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great summary. I guess I'd just say, I think, what is both powerful but also frustrating about every report like this is that, the warnings get more urgent, but the main takeaways aren't new, which is that we simply need to massively ramp up the clean energy transition. And that largely means stopping the continued build out of fossil fuel projects, which is a reality that is really uncomfortable for a lot of oil and gas majors, for banks that finance those oil and gas majors, for governments that are heavily linked to these oil and gas majors, like particularly Western developed governments like the US. And so, really, I think continuing to push and advance concretely the messaging that we cannot be investing in the kind of infrastructure that is going to lock in harrowing degrees of planetary warming is a baseline for any kind of impactful activism right now.
And of course, when we think about the most recent Inflation Reduction Act, that certainly materially hyperscales and capitalizes renewable energy, EV transition, battery manufacturing, and recycling, to name a few. How can we think about climate activism in the context of almost a precursor to legislation that we are seeing and have seen in the last several years in EU and the US, and how that is translating into things like the Inflation Reduction Act?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to that. So the way I think about it is climate activism this is what shows our elected officials, folks in power, that climate is something that the public cares about, that the public is paying attention to. This is what gets that out into the public spotlight, shows that it is a priority for people. So if we think about, say, the last really 20 years, we've had kind of more and more people getting engaged in climate activism, in the climate movement. It started out pretty small, honestly. Around like 2005 was when people kind of first started even using the word like U.S. climate movement as a term that was kind of part of the popular lexicon. It was very small at that point. It was frontline communities scattered around the country who were opposing fossil fuel extraction in their communities. It was students on college campuses. It took a long time to build that into the kind of more mass mobilization that we've seen in more recent years, which one of the most recent culminations of that was late 2019, when we had over 7 million people around the world participating in the climate strikes. And, since 2019, COVID, things like that have made these mass mobilizations a little harder to organize, but there is still work going on. There's still folks like Ilana mobilizing on college campuses. And I truly believe that we never would have seen the wins that we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act around climate without that history of people organizing. It took those massive climate strikes. It took the popularization of the Green New Deal, which organizations like Sunrise Movement, a group founded by recent college graduates, they really did a lot to get that out into the spotlight. It took the divestment movement triggering the flow of trillions of dollars away from the fossil fuel industry. All that has been necessary to get us at the point that we're at today. And if we're going to keep pushing the climate envelope, which again, the IPCC report makes it so clear we have to do, then we need to keep mobilizing. The Inflation Reduction Act, the climate provisions in that, a lot of those are really great. And how effective they are will depend in part on how that law is implemented. So we need to keep pressuring our federal government as well as state and local governments who are going to play a role in how a lot of those funds actually get dispersed. We need to keep the pressure on and keep showing that this is a priority for people so that law gets implemented effectively.
Yeah, I'll add two things to that. So I think, because that was so well said, and I don't really think I need to rehash anything, but first on the IRA, I think it's also really important to keep in mind, the Biden administration that's a major, major accomplishment. So are so many of the executive orders on corporate climate risk and incentivizing electrification, and more recently, really having a whole of government approach to environmental and climate justice. But at the same time, the Biden administration is also allowing for new oil and gas leases, new drilling. The Willow Project is a really salient example of that. All of these projects that are completely out of line with what is required to achieve a suitably rapid and socially just renewable energy transition. And so at the same time that we are celebrating what the IRA can do and ensuring that we are holding our lawmakers accountable for putting those funds to effective use, and also making sure those funds go to the grassroots organizations and communities on the front lines that are really making this transition a reality every day. We also need to be really using our voices, using every tool in the toolbox to be holding the administration and holding federal lawmakers as well as state lawmakers accountable for stopping projects that are simply going to negate, cancel out, counter, that are going to contradict ultimately what we're trying to achieve through the IRA. There is no energy transition without stopping continued fossil fuel build out. And so it doesn't really matter how much we pour into good things at the end of the day if we're still funding all the bad things that are going to really put our planet and people and our communities in jeopardy. And that's really important to keep in mind. I think the other thing, to Nick's point, is just to really emphasize that one of the ways that we create political conditions that are conducive to holding our lawmakers accountable and getting them to stop fossil fuel infrastructure build out is by employing tactics that go outside of conventional political channels and employing those every day. So not just looking at like voting or mobilizing on elections, really taking on broader structural campaigns like the call for fossil fuel divestment. I think one of the most exciting ways in which the fossil fuel divestment movement has evolved that we're now seeing is that young people, and actually a lot of older folks, like folks with the group Third Act, which was founded by environmentalist Bill McKibben, are starting to really hold the major banks and insurers, the financial institutions that are propping up the fossil fuel industry, allowing for the continuation of projects like Willow to persist. Banks like JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, several, I think Astor Perkins might have links to, but major financial institutions, I don't know if folks are here from today, are funding all of these projects and providing the backbone on which, oil and gas majors can continue to have a core business model that is absolutely lethal and absolutely contradictory to a global energy transition. So again, trying to find ways to hold all of our institutions accountable and understand that what happens at the policy level is oftentimes symptomatic of what is socially acceptable on a broader level and on a greater economic level is really important. And seeing those two things is fundamentally interlinked and knowing that we need to take action on all fronts.
Politics, legislation, policies are one thing, but at the end of the day, it's about economics, and it's economics that's driving us. So how do we deal with the market forces of OPEC and really the supply as well as the economic rent that is derived from oil and gas?
I think that's a really great point. So we do, ultimately at the end of the day, a lot depends on where dollars are going, where is money flowing into. And so one of the things that the climate provisions in the IRA does is kind of help trigger that flow of capital into clean technologies, into clean energy. And I think, there's a lot of numbers that have been kind of thrown around out there about the IRA. A lot of times you'll hear this figure somewhere between kind of 370 or 390 billion dollars in federal investments in clean energy that the law is expected to trigger. And I think it's important to realize that those numbers are estimates. That's kind of the best guess that analysts who came up with those figures made based on kind of how much they are expecting various players will take advantage of the provisions of the IRA. Depending on what actually happens in real time, the amount of money, those figures could end up being somewhat less than that. They could also end up being a lot more than that. Credit Suisse just came out with their own analysis recently, where they're predicting that the actual federal investments from the IRA are going to be more along the lines of $800 billion. So that's over twice kind of those figures that we've heard a lot. And that is not counting the private sector investments that are expected to be triggered by these federal investments. When you get more federal dollars flowing into the clean energy sector, that increases interest from private investors. So according to that Credit Suisse analysis, we could be looking at somewhere around $1.7 trillion in public and private investments in clean energy because of the IRA. And so that's it's not the whole picture, but that's at least kind of a start, I think, on what we need in order to counter the influence of countries and groups of countries like OPEC, who are putting a lot of resources and have put a lot of resources into the fossil fuel industry. And that includes the United States too, of course. The United States has put huge amounts of resources into fossil fuels historically. So that's partly why it's so important that here we're starting to see this kind of gradually starting to kind of change the direction of the ship, gradually putting more investments into clean tech.
That was so well said. I guess I'd just add this one point that from an advocacy perspective, it's also, I think, important to just keep emphasizing, making clear the reality that the renewable energy industry is seeing incredible growth. This is the future of where our investments are going to go. Many fossil fuel projects are simply going to become stranded assets the more that serious climate policies come into place. And that is a serious financial risk, not just for oil and gas majors, but for all of the institutions public and private that continue to invest in these companies. So taking the long-term view, I think in particular, and also recognizing the mountain of evidence that is really in favor of making climate smart investments. I think it was maybe 2 years ago that the BlackRock report talking about that found financial benefits from divestment came out, recognizing that even the sort of most mainstream and conservative financial institutions are being forced to shift because they understand like what the reality is, and that our job of activists is just to like make sure that we are accelerating the timeline on which that shift is happening, because it's way, way, way too slow. And that's in large part because of corporate capture of politics, and the economic power of the fossil fuel industry is important.
Earlier today, we had sessions on everything from battery recycling to methane detection from a satellite, for instance, and sustainability around agriculture using data that's research in space, for instance. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, and certainly we're hyper focused in making sure that we're intersecting sustainability, climate change with actual investments. So to that point of view, from an investor point of view, we certainly look at policies, legislation, the effects of even lobbying, but most investors aren't really thinking about the role of activism in capital formation and deployment. How should they be thinking about that?
What a good question. So I think in terms of thinking about activism, there's sort of like two answers. The first, I think it's like increasingly clear for any company that is interested in like young people as a demographic, increasingly just people, because of the growing climate consciousness of consumers, that they need to be thinking about the ways that they're actually aligning themselves with Paris Agreement goals and the energy transition. So I think sort of clear examples of that is like a lot of young people today are simply not going to bank at any of the world's 60 largest banks that have poured $5.5 trillion into fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement. Like, we're just not. So for any company, again, that is looking at that growing base, or anyone that's making investments and trying to think about where people are moving their money, it's important to recognize that like consumer power is going to increasingly shift towards like ways of living that align with the energy transition. I think the other thing is like activists have also really proven that when we get together and we organize, we can make it really, really uneconomic for companies to continue to invest in ways that are contradictory to an energy transition. So, like companies like Shell have cited fossil fuel divestment, for example, as a material risk to their business model. That is a true triumph for activists. Like, it's not just the fact that we have achieved so much in terms of shifting public consciousness, but that we have actually posed a serious financial risk to these companies and helping like make it incredibly clear that certain investments at this point in time are simply reprehensible from a broader societal standpoint. That's the kind of work that we need to be continuing to do and push on, because the reality is that we're not on track to, right now, the way these companies are operating, an energy transition is going to be incredibly difficult. Like, the top oil and gas majors plan to spend over $100 million a day, every day for the rest of this decade, exploiting oil and gas fields that cannot be burned if we're going to limit planetary warming to 2 degrees, according to The Guardian. And like 2 degrees that's a lot. The safe limit is 1.5. And every 10th of a degree really involves catastrophic impacts, particularly for those who are least responsible and most vulnerable.
Recently, I think in the last, let's say 2 to 3 years, many pensions and foundations and endowments have really, I would say, have recorded significant losses, wrote down losses from VC and PE allocation. And some pensions are facing the possibility of really being not able to meet their pension funding gap or their minimum pension liability, for instance. How should they be thinking about allocating capital into, let's say, new climate mitigation and adaptation projects via VCs and PE vehicles, despite the fact that they've lost so much already?
So what I would say to that is, in any industry, there's going to be ups and downs, and especially in, new industries that are getting off the ground. So of course, there's going to be times, and depending on everything from what's happening with clean tech to kind of the price of oil that's affected by geopolitical forces, like there's going to be times with any investment that you make that it's not going to go quite how you want it in the short term. But if you look at the long term, kind of the big picture, I would say it's very clear what the future is, and it's not in fossil fuels. And I would say that, whether you're a pension or a university or whoever you might be investing your money, if you are sinking that money into fossil fuels kind of based on what might be happening right now because the price of oil is high, then you are going to suffer in the long term. You're going to end up with stranded assets. That's kind of the term that is used a lot to describe this idea that if we are, successful on any level at reining in our consumption of fossil fuels, then investments in those industries are going to become stranded. They're going to become useless. And we've been talking a lot about the IRA. I think that's an example of the kind of law that kind of reinforces this message about where the future is going. And again, it's not in fossil fuels. It's going to take a little bit of time, of course, for all of the things that the IRA is kind of starting to move the ball on, for all of that to come to fruition. But it's pretty clear where it's going in the long term.
One of the things that we've heard from climate scientists is that the transition to electrification is not going to be easy. And even if we did everything right, possibly, the reality is that there's still going to be pockets in that transition where it's just hard to completely wean off oil and gas immediately, whether it's heavy industries, pharmaceutical, other types of areas that we don't necessarily from a public mainstream view on a regular basis, but from an industrial perspective, it's used everything from propane to different types of carbon-based products that are out there. How should we rationalize that?
The way I think about this is, there are a huge number of parts of our economy that rely on fossil fuels in some way, including, as you said, a lot of those that most of us don't really think about as a daily basis. And it's definitely true that some of them, it is going to be like there are a lot of challenges in figuring out how we make that transition. But in my mind, that should not stop us from starting to take the first step. There are so many areas in our economy where it is very evident how we can electrify, how we can make sure that electricity comes from renewable energy. And so we've kind of got sort of a two-part process that we need to be moving on here. One of those is investing in the developing the technologies that are going to help us kind of close the gaps that we haven't quite figured out how to close yet. And then the other part of it is starting to move forward as quickly as we can in the areas where we already have the technology, where it's very clear that we can do that. And those two processes kind of feed on each other too, because the more that we invest in the areas where we are already able to move away from fossil fuels, kind of the more interest that triggers in investing in the developing the technologies to take the next step. So, as you said, it's not going to be an easy, smooth process in every case. There are places where we still need to figure some things out, but it's also very clear that we can make a lot of progress right now, and that doing that is going to make it easier to close those gaps later.
Yeah, I would still just add also, like, from more of an activism standpoint, two things. So, like, one is that, I don't think any climate activist is saying, like, we can get rid of fossil fuels overnight, or that, that there's going to be a realistic energy transition that does not involve recognizing the reality that you spelled out. So I think that's just important to keep in mind when, like, understanding what the value of different kinds of activist demands are. But I think, again, the other thing to remember too is that, again, investment and divestment go hand in hand. So we also need to, like, in terms of thinking of the broader picture, be making sure that we're putting as much pressure on possible on, again, oil and gas majors and major financial institutions to be shifting their funds in the right direction so that we can achieve as holistic an energy transition as quickly as possible.
Well said. Well said to both of you. Now, recently, I've heard something that's quite interesting, and this is from a person that is actually very much a pro-climate action. But this person made a comment saying that sometimes activism can actually hurt businesses or organizations, and not everybody welcomes it. Is climate activism good for business all the time? And if not, when is it bad? And how should we rationalize that?
Well, great question. I can speak to that. And I think the short answer is that, when it comes to transitioning to clean energy, of course, there are going to be businesses that win from that and businesses that lose from that, especially those who kind of don't pay attention to the writing on the wall and who don't get on board. And so in that sense, of course, like, yes, climate activism is shifting us to renewables. Businesses who are not interested in that transition and who don't take advantage of where there's opportunities, they are not necessarily going to benefit from that. But I do think that overall, the transition to renewables it's a huge economic opportunity. It's one of the largest kind of opportunities to transform our economy that has happened in generations, and that's going to take a lot of lot of investment in jobs, in putting people to work, building electrical vehicles, building renewable energy. And so I think that overall climate activism is good for the people in business who kind of have the foresight to see where things are going and take advantage of the incredible opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I would say if you're doing bad business, then you should be scared shitless. I hope that, activists are really good at coming for all of these big financial institutions that are doing bad business right now. And that's frankly their fault. So if they're not going to transition on a timeline that's aligned with what we need to do. So yeah, if you're going to do good business, then I think activism is really, conducive to sort of supporting that. I guess the second thing I want to say on that is actually one thing that I think is really exciting is the incredible progress that we're seeing around climate liability. So liability for companies and institutions that are failing to make serious decarbonization commitments. Right now, we've got several cases moving against oil majors in the US. We've got cases in the European Court of Human Rights from youth plaintiffs that are about holding government accountable, all of these kinds of increasing examples, also of regulatory actions, ways in which companies are really going to start to feel legal as well as economic and social risk from making bad investments. And the same goes for governments. Like we saw a really cool, successful case from Client Earth in the UK, holding the UK government accountable for failing to have a sufficient net zero by 2050 decarbonization plan. I think the liability front is really something that any business should have in mind too as we go forward, particularly as we see, more of the implementation of executive orders that have already come into place, like the SEC adopting better rules around climate risk disclosure. Like the liability risk is only going to increase, and advocates are only going to get better and better at harnessing it.
So that's a great segue to my last question, which is around what can we expect from future climate activism? You mentioned liability. What other areas can we expect?
Yeah, I'll name a few things. So I think liability is a big one. I'll say again, bank divestment, really big issue. I think banks, insurers, all of the sort of financial players of the fossil fuel industry, this is the time to be really, really scared because doing something absolutely egregious. And then I'll say from a more personal standpoint, I'm really excited about the way that campus-based organizing is moving towards a more holistic view of how academic institutions lend material and reputational resources to oil and gas majors in ways that perpetuate their deadly core business model. So trying specifically to dismantle fossil fuel industry funding for climate research, which creates a systemic risk of bias. And we've sort of already seen, unfortunately, the ways that industry-funded climate research can produce really, really skewed results that go on to support really, really bad climate policy that is inimical to an energy transition. So really calling out those relationships and making sure that we have, the institutions that are meant to be producing future leaders, championing honest public knowledge of climate solutions, holding themselves accountable to the demands of climate science and climate justice. That's another really exciting and growing front for me.
Great. And how about for you, Nick?
Yes, well, that was very well said, Ilana. And you're really on the kind of cutting edge of boots on the ground, like activism. I would just say, kind of from my research, looking at like the last 20 years of climate activism and specifically youth climate activism, it's really hard to predict what's coming next because the movement is so innovative, is always kind of trying new things, just like similar to what we see with technology, like things are never standing still in the climate movement. There's always, when it stands still for too long, that's a problem. So things are always developing in new and exciting ways. And I don't know exactly what the next, say, 10 years of climate activism are going to look like. Ilana definitely hit on some really exciting things that are happening right now. But what I do know is that this issue is not going away. The effects of climate change are being felt more and more people are seeing the connection to their daily lives. And so, whatever form it takes, I know that, and I fully expect that we are going to see innovations in climate activism, approaches to climate activism that we probably haven't even imagined yet over the next 10 years. And that's what we need in order to continue pushing for this transition to renewable energy.
All right. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to David.
So this concludes our Astor Perkins quarterly event for today.